know, in the last year or two, I feel like when I host dinner parties, if people aren't in tears at the end, the conversation has been incredibly superficial, sadly. I don't think there's anyone in the room who can argue that the title of this thing is wrong. It is the end of China's economic miracle. And I thought that we would start off by putting the end of the economic miracle in context. And I love your phrase about economic long COVID. And you do a brilliant job, and I'm sure all of you have read the article, about how consumers have lost faith in their future. And you have this sentence that I really liked where you refer to self-insurance.
Yes.
People are saving, not spending. Talk to us a little bit about all the symptoms that you started picking up on that said the end of the miracle was coming even before COVID.
Right. Well, thank you, Henny, and thank you all for turning out tonight. I'm grateful to the Asia Society for inviting me. I think the important thing is, in economic speak, we talk about consumers or households. What that really means is normal people. That when we talk about that, we're talking about the behavior of the broad mass of people who are either wage employees, work at home, run a very small business, not the tycoons that we read about when Jack Ma or somebody else loses some $1 billion here or there. And I started worrying, as many people did, around 2015, because the first 2 years that she was chairman of the party, president, he still seemed to be at least carrying through some of the reform aspirations, maybe not the political ones, but the economic liberalization. And there was a very marked shift. But what really started to change was the household behavior. And we saw this starting in middle of 2015. The People's Bank of China, with obviously the approval of the Politburo, opened up the capital count, meaning made it easier for average Chinese to take their money out. Now, I had been warning a succession of US Treasury secretaries that to stop yelling at China, you want a market-determined exchange rate, because if there really is a market-determined exchange rate, the first move is going to be down, not up, because every Chinese household is 95, 99% in Chinese assets, and so they'd naturally want to diversify no matter what. But what we saw was it took about 6 months for the Chinese government and the People's Bank to get a hold of the situation. And they imposed, not terrible, but reasonably strict capital controls. And that started me thinking about shooting people with phones. No, sorry. That started me thinking about, I'm kidding, sir, don't worry. That started me thinking about, okay, is this just the rational households diversifying, or is there something more here? But I don't want to oversuggest. I saw it early, Henny, you were saying you knew people who were seeing by 2018, by the time of Xi's second term, that there were starting to be changes. What for me made it evident was the zero COVID policy. Because to me, that's what put in the average person's face that the Chinese Communist Party could and would quite arbitrarily take away your commercial rights, your property rights, your ability to make a living.
Before we get to COVID, spend a little more time talking about what you saw between 2015 and the first COVID wave.
Oh, I'm happy to have you talk about that, because to be honest, I was still formulating. I didn't have a strong feeling at that point that something was seriously wrong. What I would emphasize, because as some of you have seen, there were various people disagreeing with me, which of course is allowed. We're not in China. there were a lot of people who were sort of forecasting this inevitable decline of China. And that's a key thing that I don't believe was true. There was an inevitability as China grew richer, as more of the economy urbanized, that this sort of low-hanging fruit, as is said, was going away. But there was nothing that said you had to have a sharp slowdown or a persistent slowdown. And so I guess, I'm not trying to duck your question, but I guess in a sense the fact that I wasn't very panicked and almost no one else was in 2018, I think reflects the fact that it wasn't structural. It was accumulation of decisions and experiences for the Chinese people.
So in your article, you focus first on households, but you also talk about the corporate landscape, and that's important too, because all through the beginning years of Xi and before that, you would see the balance between privately owned enterprises and state-owned enterprises sort of going back and forth.
Yeah.
And then you had a decided tilt toward state-owned enterprises away from privately owned enterprises. Yeah. And of course, return on assets was much higher in privately owned enterprises. And you had the same sort of back and forth where entrepreneurs would push and then they would be pushed back and then they'd push again. Mm-hmm. And then all of a sudden, they stopped pushing back. They had been so, demoralized and demonized in China.
I think, putting it a little differently, so Henny knows, many of you have read or met my colleague Nicholas Lardy at the Peterson Institute, who had a marvelous book called Markets Over Mao. And he was one of the first to really document what Henny was just referring to. And sort of the key chart from his book I always refer to is you track the share of credit going to state-owned enterprises versus private enterprises, because the vast bulk of financing in China is bank credit of different forms. And basically, it's mostly going down on average, the share, sorry, I should do it this way, state-owned enterprises. And in 2015, it reaches a bottom. And then the share starts going up again. And it's been going up again ever since. And I think in retrospect, and we worried about it at the time, it's clear that that was a policy decision by Xi. And you can dress it up in various ways. And I remember, I think my last or second to last trip to Beijing before COVID, I had the privilege, I guess, to meet with Wang Qishan, who was, in that point, Xi's ideological advisor. And he gave us a long lecture, which was reported in the press, about how they had let the private sector of capitalism get out of control. They had to rebalance. And, especially given what happened in the US in 2008, that on the face of it doesn't sound that unreasonable. But obviously there was a lot more behind it than just some rebalancing.
And we'll talk about 2009, where China helped the whole world reflate after the financial crisis, and compare it with now. But let's talk about, it's 2020, and it's the first quarter of 2020, and China is experiencing the first wave. And I had become very interested in biotech. And one of my friends owned McDonald's China, and I was calling him every week, and by the second or third week of March, 80% of McDonald's in China was back to normal.
Really?
And it just seemed that China was going to have a very, very mild COVID. And I would talk to people in biotech. So Eli Lilly, for example, has a big research institute in Shanghai. And they found that so many of their research scientists left and set up very interesting companies. So they set up something called Lilly Asian Ventures to invest in the biotech startups of their former scientists. And the people there were saying, we don't have enough people to test our COVID therapeutics on. That's what it was like in the first quarter of 2020. What went wrong?
A lot of things. I think it's important to remember, and I remember being in a meeting here in New York, not far from here, in which there were a number of us in the U.S. and from the U.S. sort of very overconfidently saying, well, COVID's going to be a stress test for regimes. You know, the U.S., we've got all kinds of hospital beds. We've got great public health. We got the CDC. We got the oh, God, whatever. Anyway, FDA, sorry. And it's all going to be great. And then we're going to see all these terrible regimes like Iran get into trouble. And of course, what happened was everybody managed to mess things up. I think what is key about China in 2020, 2021 is just when they decided to lock down, how draconian it was, how arbitrarily it was applied, how long it was held on to, and that relates to Henny's point about biotech, that the Chinese, of course, did start to develop their own vaccine, and in one of the instances why I get worried about industrial policy subsidy races, you know, the Chinese insisted that it had to be their vaccine with their technology for their people, and that their client states around the world should not buy the American or the European vaccine. They should use the Chinese vaccine. And the danger with that, which sadly plays out, is you risk not having the best technology. And in this case, it arguably cost millions of lives. And certainly billions of person hours of disruption and lockdown because China did not have the vaccine we all would have expected. And I think there are experts who might disagree, but my understanding is at a very high level of seniority, including obviously President Xi, it was decided that mRNA was a foreign technology, an American technology. We weren't going to use that. And, you know, it's very funny to think about, in a Washington where everybody's paranoid about China reverse engineering, stealing technology, this, that, and the other, the sense it wasn't like, we'll figure out what's the best technology and we'll copy it. It was, we're going to have our own technology and make sure it works. And that's frankly Stalinist. That's a Stalinist way of thinking. And so it went very fundamentally wrong. And then again, I just want to emphasize the arbitrary aspect. So many of you, I know people in China or have lived in China, or some of you are Chinese and have been through this, but you know, you had literally local party officials deciding on no notice, everyone to the west of this street is in complete lockdown indefinitely, everybody to the east of this street gets to go on with their lives. Whoops, 3 days later we've extended it another 10 blocks. It's really quite extraordinary.
You know, I used to tell people China isn't a monolith, but under Xi Jinping, it is becoming increasingly a monolith.
Yeah. Again, there are political scientists and area studies experts who can speak better than I can on this, but I do think it's important to recognize that we started with a Xi regime that was benefiting from what his predecessors, not just in his role, but the accumulated predecessors of the Communist Party leadership since Deng had done. And that was from 78, 79 until through 2012. And when I refer to the end of the Chinese economic miracle, it's in part about the additional slowdown in growth, but it's in part that the miracle was that from Deng until Xi, the party did restrain itself in people's everyday life and commercial affairs. If you were a democracy protester in Tiananmen Square or in Hong Kong, if you were unfortunately a Uyghur Muslim, you know, the party had no hesitation, being quite barbarian. But if you were a normal Han Chinese, you know, occasionally you'd have to pay a bribe. Occasionally, party members son or daughter would get ahead of you in something, but basically you could go about your life. As long as you were not political, you could just go about your business. And the business of China was business. And so a key point about the monolithicness is it's not just that they've successfully created this myth, amazingly successfully, that what had been a China of regions, of separate dialects, of different ethnicities, even within that 98% of Chinese citizens are Han Chinese, all speaking Mandarin, and it's all one country, which is an incredible achievement. But that you've lost the flexibility and experimentation that Xi and Jiang Zemin and some of the other previous leaders of China allowed. It used to be there was, and a lot of scholars have written about this, there was competition between the regions in economic terms and social terms. You would let there be experiments in different parts of China. It was, in a sense, a good version of federalism. Again, I don't want to overstate it. There were always prison camps. There were always secret police. But there was a lot of room. And as long as you didn't challenge the party, there was a lot of room. And that's gone away.
I want to spend a few more minutes talking about the miracle before we go even more into the reversal of that miracle. And, I think the whole story of COVID and the refusal to find the best vaccines is part of that. So I grew up in a medical family. 4 generations of the women in my family are doctors. And to my horror, I sort of started turning into my mother and became very interested in flows into biotech. And as recently as 2017, 2018, I was in Beijing, and I go to meet a doctor who had been here, distinguished career as a molecular biologist, and had gone back to China a few years before. He had unlimited research budgets. He could go to any conference in the world. And when I met him in Beijing, he had 2 name cards. And one was of Director General of a research institute in molecular biology. And another one was as the co-founder of a company called Beijing, which is listed both on NASDAQ and in Hong Kong. And I thought, China is really beginning to understand what you need for innovation. And the last thing he said to me was, Henny, if you ever need to transcend the internet firewall, you just come to my research institute. We have no firewall here. That's what it was like then. And you could feel so hopeful. And when I first came back to New York, because I couldn't deal with the quarantines, one of the people who was also camping out in New York was the head of Posen. And Fuxing in Mandarin, Posen, had actually licensed Biotech. And he's hanging out in New York because he can't deal with the quarantines any more than I can. And when my friends would visit him, his wife would say, please don't ask about why he can't get approval to save lives with Biotech. And it's so sad to see how we all thought China was moving up the value-added curve and just one man kind of reversing it. And, all of us here, to some extent, I think, are the beneficiaries of globalization.
Yes.
And China was one of the first to opt out. And we will now get closer to where the heart of your argument, where you're talking about risks that China is so sensitive about, which is capital flight and talent flight, right?
I think there's a lot of ground between those sentences. What I want to stress is there are these stories of titans of research or business, and understandably the press and people living in New York, moving the circles, Henny, and some of you do, focus on this. And we also have a tendency in the U.S. to talk about the Elon Musks and the Larry Elliots and the whoever. But again, what I want to stress is what was the big change in China is what happened to the average people, the normal people, the people running small businesses, the employees, that was the big shift. I mean, so as long as she was doing corruption, anti-corruption campaigns that so happened to take out political rivals like Beaujolais or princelings of other kinds, you know, the normal people could say, well, that's great. Who's for corruption? They're arrogant. As long as he was taking out or disciplining, let's say, these individual tycoons, you know, again, some people in China say, oh, that's too bad. Some people in China say, oh, that's great, you know. And you could cloak it as this common prosperity narrative that we're rebalancing inequality, we're rebalancing the state. But the capital flight, the talent flight, is in my view, this is the insight from Albert Hirschman, the very legendary political economy writer, that you know, you essentially, when you're dealing with a government regime as a normal person, you got three choices, what he calls exit, voice, and loyalty. Loyalty is you stick with it, whatever the regime does, and that's been the default in China, and default for most of us, most of the time. Voice is you raise a complaint if you think there's a problem or an injustice or something going wrong. In China, that obviously has its limitations, and it has been getting more and more limited. So then, if you believe there's a problem, your incentive is to resort to instead to what we call exit. Now, exit can mean literally people leaving the country. We're not going to see millions of people streaming out of the country. This is not, at least this is not my forecast. But I do want to point out a couple things. First, that what people will at the margin, starting mostly with the more sophisticated, the more well-off, but people will at the margin start moving money out, starting to hedge their bets. As Henny mentioned, summarizing my piece, there's a desire to self-insure. And part of the way you self-insure is you keep things in cash, you stay liquid, you don't tie things up. But part of the way you self-insure is you diversify, you get money out, you get money into other currencies. If you're running a business, you get alternative sources of supply or alternative places to produce. If you're running a family, you get some of your kids out to study elsewhere or work elsewhere. And so the point I want to build on this is a couplefold. First is, this is a dynamic we've seen in other autocratic economies. And again, that's why I want to stress, excuse me, that the end of the miracle is this change. There's been very little pressure for exit, almost none, in China from '79 till now. There were political refugees, but it's not a mass phenomenon by any means. Whereas once you start down this road, like in Latin America in the past or Venezuela today, you have an active movement of people threatening to move money, talent, production. But additionally, and this is me forecasting, it may not be right, but I think it will, unfortunately. When you have the threat of exit, the autocrat, the ruling regime, starts putting up more barriers. And we're seeing that now. We're seeing that you can't publish information that's bad news about companies. We're seeing that they're enforcing a bit more some of the exit rules. It's harder to get a passport. It's harder to get a student visa. It's harder to invest abroad. They're making examples of people who take their money and use these various gimmicks to get around the restrictions. And we've, in this kind of dynamic, once you start down that road, it becomes doubly problematic because first, the more people, the autocrat, the ruling regime puts up barriers, the more incentive there is for average people to notice it and say, okay, I've got to defend myself against this. I've got to figure out a way around it. I got to get some way out. And again, we've seen this in we've seen this in Russia. We've seen this in Latin America. The second point is, if, as Henny's indicating, and I think unfortunately is true, this ends up being more and more looking like a Maoist, Stalinist kind of regime where it really is one-man rule. It's much harder, of course, for that person to credibly convince people, I'm not going to take away your money. I'm not going to take away your rights. He can come out and say, well, I only did that. I'm not going to admit it was a mistake. It saved millions of lives, but I only did what we did because of COVID. So don't worry about it. You can stay put. Nothing bad's going to happen again unless there's another pandemic. But it's not really credible. That's the difference between having an autocrat versus having at least a norm, as was the case after Deng, that there's some limit on power. And then to get more narrowly economic about it, going back to something Henny was saying a minute ago, if already in this context she is favoring the state-owned enterprises, which again, all the flows of credit, all the investment plans seem to do, then any effort to respond to private sector economic problems becomes more fraught. So we're seeing that right now. As anybody who's Asia Society member or patron knows, there's a bit of a real estate problem in China right now. Part of my point is that they're not going to deal with it very well or be able to deal with it very well under the current circumstances. Because what happens is, and we've seen this, they try to do stimulus policies. They try to cut interest rates. They try to put money in people's pockets specifically to buy real estate or buy an auto, buy durable goods, and people don't respond. They put the money back into cash. They refuse to spend it, basically. And that's the logical result. Again, we've seen this before, that if you've got a capricious, arbitrary regime, you don't know what the terms of the deal are going to be. You don't want to tie up your money. You don't know if they're going to change the policy at any minute. And so you just stay liquid. And so therefore, these stimulus programs don't work very well. And then and the technocrats under him who want results, or not even the technocrats, the apparatchiks under him.
Nice distinction.
Well, it's changing, unfortunately. Want results, and so they start throwing more money into the state-owned enterprises because there they can command results. They can say, you have to produce this much. You cannot lay anybody off. You have to do this. And that just feeds the cycle. So I don't want to say, there's a point in my article, I think, where I come close to saying point of no return. that's a little bit further than I really want to go.
No, use that phrase.
Okay.
Point of no return.
So I'm culpable, but I don't think it's point of no return, but I think it's point of no return as long as she is in charge. Let's put it that way.
When I read your article and when I listened to you, the adjective that I use, I don't know whether it's Stalinist or whatever, but is paranoid. And Xi Jinping is paranoid, and he's paranoid about himself, his hold on power, but also he's paranoid on behalf of China. And one of the things you notice when you live in China is a sort of paranoia. Why? Because China has no food security and no energy security. It's very different than, say, a Russia, which is far weaker, but has both energy and food security, and the U.S. as well, which has both. How dangerous is a weak and paranoid China compared to the China that we used to think of as far more powerful?
When my wife and I went to China for the first time in 2012, one of the things we found most striking, and it was an observation many people made that was very interesting, especially since I had worked a lot on Japan in the past, was the amount of self-confidence with which Chinese people seem to be able to take things, whether technology, styles, whatever, from the West, from Japan, from elsewhere, and not have it interfere with their sense of identity. It's, we'll take what's good, we'll do that, we're Chinese, we're the ancient civilization, this is all cool.
Center of the world.
Yeah, no. But it was really striking. And then at times I felt like I really wish Americans were that open to international influence without getting insecure or upset about it. So I just want to emphasize, I share some of your feeling about this. I think when we get into the international sphere, there's obviously a lot of things going on that have nothing to do with economics. And you can sing until you're blue in the face, which I and some of my colleagues at the Peterson Institute do, that if you're worried about food security or you're worried about energy security, the important thing is some combination of resilience and diversification. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be hostile to the rest of the world. It can be that you get the rest of the world into deals with you and mutual interdependence, and you stockpile and you create, So I don't want to say, Japan is not at the moment threatening other people and doing things, even though it's at least as energy insecure and food insecure as China. What I do think is interesting, and which I've said to some people who work for the president, our president, is we've seen this shift that for the first couple of years of the Biden administration, and certainly throughout the Trump administration, there was this repeated concern, not unreasonably, that, oh my God, China's eating our lunch in technology, China's growing so fast, the more economically powerful they get, the more of a threat they are to us. And then some months ago, maybe roughly around the time my article gets published, not to be too cute about it, the president, our president, came out a couple times in public and said, yeah, China's economy is in really bad shape, and that makes them more dangerous because they're going to be more aggressive. Now, these two are not necessarily in contradiction because they're two separate channels. One is the richer they are, the bigger they are, the more confident and the more capacity they have. The other is the more desperate they are, the more politically pressured they are from economics, maybe the more the wag the dog they want to distract. And social science has evidence on both. But it is, I know you asked about China, but I just want to emphasize that there is this two-way action here, that if the U.S., whatever happens to China, their economy's up, I'm scared. Their economy's down, I'm scared. It does reinforce a dynamic in China and elsewhere as well.
So before I shift to the other side of the equation and talk about the U.S., I just wanted to say that I loved when you said, don't celebrate, adjust expectations. But before we shift to the other side of the equation and talk about American policy, which, by the way, Adam describes as confrontational, restrictive, and punitive, I just wanted to see if any of you have questions up until this point on the miracle and the end of the miracle and focusing on China before we move on to the next part of the discussion.
I don't know if they're moving mics or something, but there's a gentleman in back there in a blue shirt. Thank you.
Do you want to come up and get my mic?
No, I think we can hear you. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks. Just a question on the excesses caused from the economic miracle, right? And how much of the current slowdown is actually addressing some of those side effects of the 20, 30-year growth. Mm-hmm. And in order to do that, you have to slow things down. Yeah. You have to fight the excess corruption. You have to address many other issues, inequality. Mm-hmm. I'd like to hear your thoughts. Thanks.
Pollution as well, all these
Thank you.
Costs.
So I'm going to sound probably more wonky economist for the next minute or so. I apologize. But so there is a school of thought, and it's one which I was familiar with when working on Japan in the 90s as well and other places, that you have too fast, low-quality growth. You build up fundamental imbalances in society, and you have to weed those out, or else inevitably you'll have problems. And usually this is cited in the context of China, real estate boom and succession of real estate booms and busts, among other things, also the corruption, as you mentioned. My view of the matter, looking at the last 45 years, is that is a second-order effect that's treated as mistaken for a first-order effect, and that it's a highly variable and contingent thing that is treated as a structural. In fact, it's often referred to as a structural set of problems. And so let me take one more minute if I could, because it's a very serious question, to try to explain. So as I said in a recently published response to some of my critics in foreign affairs, all economies slow down over time. As you approach the growth frontier, which is what or the productivity frontier, which is how economists refer to it, it's harder to maintain a big growth rate. The big growth comes when you have a bunch of people in agriculture and in an informal economy, and you move them into manufacturing and services, and you move them into the city, and you move them into a market economy. And the next big growth comes when you accumulate capital or get foreign investment, and you endow those workers with technology that they didn't have. And so there's just a natural, automatic, I mean, this is one of the few things in economics that really is true, that over time there's what's called convergence. That as your income rises per capita, your rate of growth slows. It'll vary over time, it'll be setbacks, but when you look at the long run averages, that's what happens. Now, and so one way of looking at this is, which a number of people have pointed out, is if you plot over time what's basically the growth rate of China, and you stagger it, and you do the growth rate of South Korea, and you do the growth rate of Japan, 20 years back, 10 years back, they fit almost perfectly. And that's a very robust fact. And so to me, that's very strong prima facie evidence that it's this fundamental slowing, this life cycle, as it were, of an economy as it grows, becomes more technologically sophisticated, industrializes, urbanizes, that's the real driver of these long-term growth rates, average growth rates. It's not all this China-specific stuff about quality of growth and all these things. That may affect year-to-year fluctuations, that may affect the distribution of growth. It's not zero. But basically, China, South Korea, Japan, they all just follow the same path, hitting the same benchmarks. When they're at this level of GDP per capita, they're at this rate of growth. 1 second, sir. And so when I say the end of the Chinese miracle, what I'm pointing to is a further sustained deceleration of growth off that long-term path. That's the distinction I'm making. Sorry if that was too nerdy. I'm sure you could follow it, but it might have been too nerdy. Yeah, the gentleman there.
Hi, Adam. It's Dan Alpert. Good to see you again.
Thanks for coming.
So, I think we can all agree that at 1.4 billion people, China is sort of sui generis in terms of economic examples.
I actually completely reject that argument.
Okay, fine.
So,
Then we don't agree.
We don't all agree.
Good. That's fine. But I feel very strongly that it's monetarily sovereign, at least for now. It has access to global markets in terms of exports. It definitely is making those deals you spoke of in terms of resources. And so some of the insecurity that we spoke about, I think your example of Japan is actually quite correct. Thus far, China has obviously not had domestic consumption at a level where it can avoid what I'll call punitive levels of investment, dragging things forward in a way that creates oversupply. And in the terms of the third component, exports, it had been able to pull the pedal off a little bit and is now becoming more dependent on it as investment gets pulled back. The social contract, however, was basically making jobs available for people in an economy that is still divided between urban and non-urban population. So my question for you is, how you had about 12 million people turning 18 every year in China, even with an aging population. Those people needed jobs. And to the extent that China can't provide those jobs, do you see internal social disharmony fomenting? And is that a perhaps bigger risk than some of the economic risks that we're talking about going forward?
Thanks. I didn't realize that's where you were going, Dan. So thank you for clarifying at the end. Simple answer is yes. I mean, we know, again, though it's not a sui generis China thing, we know across one of the very robust results in political science is across societies over time, bulges of youth unemployment, particularly of unemployment of relatively higher educated youth, is a recipe for social unrest. So there were demographers who were predicting the Arab Spring a few years before it happened because there was a huge bulge of underemployed and unemployed people who went to college and had frustrated expectations. I know you know this, I just did say. So I do think that's more, this is why I talk mostly in terms of the political economy aspects and don't make any grand predictions about regime stability or social tension, because A, I don't know enough, and B, I do think there are things like that that are not strictly speaking economic, that are very fundamental. That said, I also believe that the decisions and rhetoric being made by Xi at present, as I read them in translation, I don't read Mandarin, are reinforcing this and making this worse than it has to be. We all saw the reports about when he says the young people have to learn to eat bitterness. You boys have to stop being Nancy boys and dressing up in metrosexual and be aggressive. Your kids have to stop wasting so much time on video games, and I'm gonna, intervene in your life. This is scary stuff, and sometimes you can sustain that for a very long time, and sometimes it blows up, and I do not have any clue as to the relative risks on that. I will just acknowledge that that's really important, and it underlines to me just how aggressively she is going down this, I hate saying cultural revolution, but that echoes of that path. That's very scary. So, Henny, you want to pick who goes next?
You pick.
Okay, I think the gentleman in the gray suit there, I'm not seeing anybody on the right side of the room, so feel free to wave your hand and we'll do common prosperity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Posen, for being here with us and sharing your thoughts. So harkening back to what you mentioned earlier about Japan and Korea and the many analogies which apply in the situation, I know you know both those countries well, and I'm sure you're aware that in the 1980s, till the end of the 80s, the Bank of Japan administered the financial system and directed credit quotas to each of the individual financial institutions. After the fact, it took like almost a decade for this to come out, but the banks all basically admitted, if they were told 8% was your volume growth this year, they grew their loans by 8%. And that, in the end of the day, there were other issues, but that was a critical component of what ended up being a lack of responsibility at the individual institutional level to take responsibility for the loans they were making. They were being told to generate loans. The same thing happened in Korea. And so, to a slightly lesser extent, but it was very analogous. Korea, we know what happened there in the late 90s. Japan suffered for a long period of time, but they were wealthy enough to get through that. But as you know, since the early 1980s, China has been doing the exact same thing in their financial system, going from $0 to $65 trillion in their financial system. And to this day, total social financing is growing exactly as directed, whether it's the CCP or the People's Bank of China. Do you think that China will be able to emerge from this and have a normalization of their financial system in a way that the banks can get away from directed volume quotas of lending to grow the economy?
Thank you. I guess I have to start that I actually do somewhat disagree with your characterization of the Japanese and Korean experience. There's no question all that was going on. But one of the striking things, going back to my imaginary graph of this is Japan, this is Korea 15 years later, this is China 15 years later, is that Korea, for all that happened acutely in 97, 98, they did not have the property crash. They did not have the extended damage throughout their economy that the Japanese did. They did not have the interruptions in investment for good or for ill that the Japanese did, and yet they follow basically the same growth path. So I don't want to be contentious here, but I just fundamentally push back at the idea that the banking decisions are the main driver here. I do think, and here's where I agree with you, I do think that government-directed credit does have real costs. And there is no question that the kind of characterization you make is entirely accurate for China. And so one way of telling the story of the last 10, 15 years in China, or one strand, I shouldn't say telling the story, one strand, which is part of the reason, frankly, why I think a number of us didn't see what was happening in China fully, is there was this large number of technocrats at the People's Bank, at the CSRC, the CBRC, what's now the CBIRC. These are the acronyms of the various regulators, financial regulators in China. We're trying, with pretty express support from the top of the Politburo, to try to change things. And you did have, in a way that I wouldn't say never, but I think not on a scale that we have a much bigger scale than we saw ever in Korea or Japan, examples made of people who lost money. I mean, the big policy banks in China, like big banks everywhere, were safe. But there were a lot of small and medium-sized institutions got into trouble. There was the various repeated crashes, including of the, sorry, I forget its name, the tech stock index that was in Shenzhen. Anyway, there were these various bubbles and crashes. People lost a lot of money. There were the wealth management products that were a huge scam that lost a lot of money. So in a sense, they did better on moral hazard, not for the bankers, but for the investors than the US did in the run-up to 2008, and certainly than Japan did in the late 80s and early 90s. So it's a very mixed bag, and I think it's just not it's not that tidy a story. But I just want to say that part of the reason why I was optimistic and slow to recognize some of what was going on is because there very clearly was, I see Henny's leaning forward to cut me off, but I'm going to take another minute. There very clearly was, for all the monolithicness, all of Xi's exerting power, there clearly was a group of high-level senior officials who believed that Xi had given them orders and encouragement to try to keep out the rot. And you can even argue that part of the reason we have the crash we have now is because in, was it 2000 or 2001, they changed the regulations on the real estate. And that's part of what led to the crash in Evergrande and all these things happening. So again, it doesn't go against your position. So then I just want to stress that this is, you know, even under Xi, this is a very messy history. So I reread, as I was finishing my article, I reread most of parts of Ezra Vogel's biography of Deng, which for those of you who can read Chinese, you know, there may be many better sources, but for English language, it's a very good source. And one of the things I had forgotten about that was very striking was how there was this, from 79 to almost 92, there was an ongoing debate, I guess, between Deng and the head of the China Development Bank. And the head of the China Development Bank, who was also a longtime historical communist leader, was like fire and brimstone against moral hazard. He didn't want there to be too much lending. He didn't want there to be too fast growth. He didn't want welfareism, and I've checked. And so when Xi refers to welfareism, which sounds to us accurately like Ronald Reagan saying we don't want welfare queens getting fat, which is offensive, but that's what it sounds like. This person was using the same term, same term in Chinese, debating with Deng in the 80s and early 90s. So ultimately, and this is why I push back a bit at Dan about the uniqueness. Ultimately, there are these political economy dynamics of financial management and the perverse incentives of various people and the difficulties of policymakers calling a stop to things when it causes a mess, that I think drive the story. I hope that wasn't too unresponsive to your question, but I mean, that's just, I see it as messier, I guess.
You know, one of the reasons I love being at the Asia Society is how exciting the questions are
Oh,
from
yeah,
the
it's great.
audience.
It's great.
And I wanted just to pick up on your point, because in addition to capital misallocation, there's also huge opportunity costs and time. So I happen to live in Japan for the bubble years, and it's 1992, and I'm moving to Hong Kong, and I'm having my farewell, the sayonara meal with the Vice Minister of Finance at the time, then Sakakibara.
Oh, geez.
And he describes long-term capital, long-term credit bank of Japan as the carp of the Japanese financial system. They take bites of every piece of garbage at the bottom of the sea. And at the time, LTCB's top clients, borrowing clients, 9 out of 10 were bubble companies, and the one that wasn't was actually TEPCO.
Right.
It did not end well. So you have this opportunity cost with time when you're not dealing with the misallocation of capital in a timely manner. And, you know, it was only 10 years after I had that conversation with Sakakibara that they finally dealt with banks like Long-Term Credit Bank of Japan. And, you know, I think you do see that misallocation of capital in China. And one of the problems with the stimulus that, as you rightly point out, has no effect is almost all the problem in China, as you point out, is insufficient demand. But almost all the measures they've adopted act on the supply side. So actually the supply-demand imbalance gets worse, not better.
It's really interesting you put it that way, Henny, because as I may have mentioned, Peterson Institute, we had our board of directors meeting yesterday here in New York. So thank you for coming tonight, not last night. Or rather, thank you to the Asia Society for scheduling it tonight, not last night. But anyway, someone I won't identify, but who is a member of our board and is very involved in China and very knowledgeable, was claiming that he had had exactly that conversation with the new finance minister. That you all are treating this like it's a supply problem and it's really a demand problem, or you're treating this like a demand problem and it's really a supply problem. You know, it's at that level of debate. And you know, as bringing it back to the gentleman's question about what lies ahead, you know, part of where I came out in my analyses of Japan, which not everybody agrees with, but I think have largely been proven to be right, is there very little was written in stone. You could get away from the bad assets. You would take the losses and you move on. That's what capitalists do. And I pushed back against some people who were insistent that Japan could never grow again or it had to work off all the assets. Well, it never did, but it grew again. And so I guess that's all I'm trying to say, is that China can change. I just feel like under Xi, it's very unlikely to work or to be pursued. Why don't I leave it there?
So let's turn to the other side of the equation now. You describe American policy, and I think all of us would agree, as confrontational, restrictive, and punitive. How do we get to the point where we can have a more constructive attitude and have an open door for people and capital?
Right. Well, to be fair, I do think the Biden administration, since the speech by Treasury Secretary Yellen and the, in my opinion, less constructive speech by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan last April, there has been obviously a thaw.
tall wall
Yeah.
speech.
Yeah. That, and then we've seen the succession of Yellen and Raimondo and Blinken and Kerry, and notably not Ty, go to China. And we have coming up at the APEC summit bilateral, supposedly, between a summit type bilateral between Xi and Biden coming up. So they have, the Biden administration has chosen in the last several months to try to ease things up a bit. The reason I brought out the thing about the tension between I'm scared of China because they're weak, I'm scared of China because they're strong, is to emphasize what you're saying, which is how do we get to something more useful? Now, if you're a true China hawk, which there are people in this administration and in the previous administration who genuinely are, it's we have a small window before China is militarily dominant and threatening, and we have to weaken them directly before that happens.
In a world, as you stress, where everything is dual-use technology.
Yeah, and I find this chilling, probably wrong, but especially I want to emphasize what you just pointed out, that the sanctions regime, the economic measures are unlikely to work very well. So part of it is we don't have if you take that point of view, we don't have an end game for China. Sanctions tend to work, and my colleagues at the Peterson Institute have done some of the foundational work on this. Sanctions tend to work best when they're multilateral, or at least plurilateral, not just one country doing it, and when you have a clear goal. If you stop doing this, we will stop beating you on the head.
You know, it's so interesting. Jamie Dimon was speaking at a conference
Who?
2 weeks ago, Jamie Dimon, and he said,
No, seriously, who?
the head of J.P. Morgan.
Oh, a banker. Okay, sorry. Go
So
ahead.
he said the U.S. has substituted sanctions for diplomacy. And that's exactly what you're saying, and I hear that more and more, and I think that's
Well,
such a
I'm
good
actually
point.
saying something a little more sophisticated, which is you can
Never
use...
be invited back.
No, I'll never be invited back. You're fine. That you can use sanctions, but only in certain circumstances, and you actually have to have a goal. And part of the problem, so the Trump administration had a goal which was simply undeliverable. They said, we want to put up tariff barriers and other sanctions to make sure that there's a trade balance that's in favor of the U.S., and that just simply wasn't going to happen. And then the Biden administration came in, and as far as we could tell, their only goal was to weaken China, which, may be a legitimate goal for various reasons, but you're not going to get there through sanctions and this kind of policy. So anyway, I think there's been a lot of statements recently from Biden administration top officials backing off some of that, and I think that's wise. And saying we're not out to make China poorer. We're out to prevent them from having...
She's doing a good enough job on that.
Well, maybe that allows the Biden administration to say it, but okay. That's good diplomacy. You take advantage of the situation. And that's kind of where I end up in my article, is when I argue for taking advantage of the situation in China, I don't mean, they're down, let's kick them. I mean, take advantage of the situation to more clearly make a distinction between being concerned about certain behaviors of the Communist Party regime from the Chinese economy as a whole, and from average Chinese, whatever that means, as opposed to party officials, and not fearing the money, the talent, the technology that comes out of China, if anything, encouraging it to exit, going back to that concept we were talking about a little bit ago. And this is one of the places where it's not even diplomacy, it's a choice the U.S. makes. We can be, as I would like us to be, welcoming to Chinese students, Chinese talent, Chinese workers, Chinese capital, Chinese knowledge, or we can be hostile to it. And when people talk about containment in the Cold War of the Soviet Union, one aspect of the policy that was successful was we were not trying to contain those aspects. We were, if anything, encouraging desire for exit from the Soviet Union of people, of money, of ideas. And so I think we can do that again with China. But if you have too aggressive hostility that's based on some racial or cultural basis and every human being who comes from China is a spy and all these things, then you can't do that. And that puts us, I think, it squanders a potential advantage.
Do you think that this speaks to a lack of confidence in the U.S.? The way we have demonized so many Chinese academics here?
Well, again, I think there's two aspects to this argument. And I'm not a security expert, but I've talked with people in Washington who are security experts and who are security officials. So I think there's two aspects to this. Before we get to the high concept of are we too insecure, there's just the practical aspect. I mean, I've talked to somebody who's in counterintelligence, and they point out that even if somebody is a spy, it isn't necessarily a net negative to have them in the country. It may be that they provide benefits that they unsuccessfully offset by spying. It may be that you can turn them. It may be that you can feed them false information that leads to other behavior. It may be that you can learn more, you capture them at the right moment, you can learn a lot more about what's going on in China than what they learned from you. At the same time, in a world of artificial intelligence and satellites and various technologies I know nothing about, it's kind of absurd to think that if the Chinese Communist Party or a favored company in the Chinese system wants a particular American technology, the most efficient way for them to do it is to get 10 kids out of Beta, have them apply to MIT, wait 6 months, find out if they get scholarships, 5 of them get here, somehow surreptitiously train them to be spies without tipping MIT's hand, get them in the right labs, get them there, and 3 years later, versus press a button on a North Korean hacker and have the North Korean hacker steal the plans. So before we get to the concept of is the U.S. Too scared, I think we have to start with the very practical concept of no matter how many senators stand up with teeth pointing, I need to get rid of these Chinese. I'm much more worried about good old-fashioned espionage of the electronic sort. and deterring or preventing that is far more important than this stuff. But anyway, on the fear side, I mean, this is a very sophisticated audience. You've all read things like, you've got Kevin Rudd's new book on the Chinese motivation, which is very much focused on Xi. You've got Graham Allison's, The War Trap? You've got these various things. There's many arguments out there, and there's a long international relations history of countries misperceiving their enemies, both in intention and capability. And we've got brave people like Jessica Chen Weiss, who I think is at Cornell now, who are out there, a Chinese-American political scientist, who's out there saying, calm down a little. It's not that we have to say that the Chinese Communist Party or Xi in particular is a good person or doesn't have designs on Taiwan, but you don't have to make them out to be uniformly hostile, evil, always looking for the next violent advantage. And so, as a secondhand student of history, I remember very much going to Germany in 1990 and then living there in 1992, 93. And at that time, I got to see what East Germany was really like after reunification. And I had been brought up on the sometimes classified, sometimes not, and mostly declassified, intelligence reports of the U.S. intelligence community that East German per capita GDP was 2/3 or more of West German per capita GDP. This was a highly functioning society. This was this, this was that. And East Germany was less than 1/3 per capita income, and per capita income is shorthand as well for technological sophistication, functionality of the society. I mean, that's basically, it's the best shorthand you got. And again, and Dan Alpert went through this too, you know, we had the long lag in the 90s where, to cite as Vogel again, Japan as number one, or Chalmers Johnson on METI, and all these perceptions of Japan as this juggernaut persisted well through the mid-90s. So, and then out of all of this, there is the Pacific Ocean between US and China. There is nuclear deterrence between the US and China. And whenever I push, and so again, this has nothing to do with my, I mean, I've called Xi repeatedly an autocrat. I'm not in cahoots with any Chinese organizations. I'm not going back to China anytime soon. But, you know, this, I keep asking the security experts, you know, essentially, what is the threat you're so scared of? And isn't the best way to confront that threat is to confront it, since it's really about invasions of Taiwan, South China Seas, threats to Korea and Japan, isn't the way to confront that threat by continuing to expand military forward presence in those places and military spending in those countries? And why do you need all this other stuff, which isn't going to work? And what I'm always told is, you don't understand and it's classified. Okay, I don't understand and I don't have access to classified information, but fine.
Can I ask the audience one question? How many of you think that we should encourage the best and brightest from China to come here and study specifically STEM subjects? How many think we should encourage that?
Cool, the Asia Society
We're
in New
with
York.
The reason I ask this, I happened to be in Shanghai for the Lujiazui Forum, and it was June of 2019, so pre-COVID, and actually just before the first demonstration in Hong Kong. And I had somebody on my panel who bounced between MIT and Shanghai Jiaotong Daxue, one of the universities in Shanghai. And he said virtually no student who was admitted to MIT from mainland China could get the visa. Mm-hmm. And I thought, what a shame. And then I carefully checked, made sure Adam wasn't a graduate of U Chicago, and asked the U Chicago head, they have a branch, a beautiful campus in Hong Kong, do you have that problem? And he said no, because obviously the US government does not consider economists a threat.
It's true. We're more in that capital misallocation category. Wasted opportunities, not direct threats. No, but look. I do. Maybe I'm blinded by my sort of left-wing biases that I don't view it as a coincidence that at the same time there's a huge spread of nativism in the U.S. and fears of people coming up from below the southern border who are going to do terrible things to us, is the same time at which we're saying, oh my God, we can't let the Chinese students in or the Chinese visitors in. I view it as part of a general trend in Congress, and a trend which I think is exaggerated in perception in terms of its extent, but there in the broader American body politic. And we've seen this be driven in the past in the US historically. I don't want to say there's fixed cycles and waves, but we've seen it come and go. And again, I assume everybody in this room is familiar with the China Exclusion Act on immigration in the late 19th century, where, you know, they kept the Jews out during World War II, but that was a matter of arbitrary policy. They could have let them in. They explicitly said no Chinese in law in the late 19th century.
the Japanese were on the winning side,
Right.
and they couldn't get the other powers to recognize
Yeah.
Japanese rights
Right.
of immigration and eliminate all the privileges of extraterritoriality that the foreign powers had in Japan.
Yeah, and in China as well. And so I just, again, I don't want to sort of dismiss it. I just want to suggest that China and U.S. are both very large. As you mentioned, I think talking about food or energy insecurity for China is a bit misleading because they do have hydropower. If they don't care about global warming for the time being, they've got an enormous amount of coal, an absolutely enormous amount of coal that it can burn very easily. If they don't do the great leap forward, they can grow a lot of rice and wheat. They like soybeans, they like pork, but they can. So U.S. and China both are continental powers that are largely closed economies that are very big. And so we have this tendency to view, as you were saying earlier, I think, in my view, hype up external threats, whereas things are very much driven by domestic problems, including the youth unemployment in China that someone was raising a little bit ago.
You know, the Science and Technology Agreement, which has been in effect since Carter was president, is coming up for renewal. And, you know, there is a view in Washington that China is developing biological weapons. Let me ask you a very personal, subjective question. If people in if the average person in the Department of Defense in Washington today was listening to our conversation, would they think we're just incredibly naive?
Well, I would think they're incredibly off base because their ability to develop biological weapons has absolutely zero to do with their ability even to get high-tech semiconductors, let alone any of these other economic things. I was in a dinner, and to be sort of name-dropping, I was in a dinner in Washington last week with the foreign minister and finance minister of an non-China Asian country. And I sort of posed them a version of this question. And they said to me, well, you know, North Korea doesn't have a very good economy and they do a lot of damage. So, you know, it's not that China isn't a threat or under certain circumstances couldn't be a very, very dangerous threat. It's just that it's not about the economic relationship. I mean, North Korea is, and you know, and all this stuff about China is, you know, producing fentanyl. I believe it. I believe it. I believe they even probably rationalize it in certain quarters themselves. This is no different than the opium war that the West foisted on us. So why shouldn't we sell them what they're addicted to and let them suffer? You know, and I think and if that's true, I think it's criminal and we should be opposing it. It's not high tech to produce fentanyl. It's not requiring huge allocations of capital to produce fentanyl. All that's required is you are nasty enough to want to do it. So then comes the question, well, then why can't we use economics to get them to stop doing it? And the answer is we've had economic sanctions in North Korea of incredible effectiveness, putting them into recurrent famine based on their own decisions, but unalleviated because of our sanctions. Putting them in recurrent famine, and that hasn't stopped them distributing malware and negative intelligence and drugs and so on. Sorry to sound agitated, but I'm imagining you as the putative national security person. So, you know, if you know, it's like, again, my anger isn't so much that people are worried about North Korea or about China. It's that supposed professionals in security don't seem to look at the evidence, which is these economic tools don't do very much for you in this regard. It's like with nuclear weapons in the 50s. The Eisenhower administration got very into talking about little tactical nuclear weapons and advanced deployment of nuclear weapons, and it was all because they wanted to get defense on the cheap. They didn't want to actually have to put troops at risk. They didn't want to actually have to spend on armaments. It's much cheaper to have nuclear weapons. Similar, and it was just as ineffective because it was not a credible threat that you were going to start throwing around, or God forbid, tactical nuclear weapons in the middle of Germany. Similarly, not through the exact same mechanism, but similarly, this is all about a bunch of people who take the Chinese threat seriously, perhaps too seriously, perhaps rightly seriously, but do not want to engage in actual military threatening and forward deployment and deterrence on a direct basis. They want to do it through economics, and then they want to sell it that, by the way, this is going to be great for the American people rather than depriving them of money because it's going to take all these jobs from China and bring them here, which is a lie. So, you know, that person, that nominal national security person who I've met multiple times, can say I'm naive, and I'll just say they're just blind.
You know, I'm just going to ask one or two more questions, and then I want all of you, if you have any final questions. But in a way, you know, China's part of a larger phenomenon of deglobalization. So we could talk about decoupling, and we have talked about decoupling with China, but don't you think to some extent the U.S. is decoupling from the whole world?
Yes.
When you look at things like the IRA,
Yeah.
which gets a lot of kudos here, but in Asia it's seen as American first protectionism.
Yeah.
And it's seen that way by all of our allies, including Singapore and Korea.
Yep. So 3 years ago, I published an article in Foreign Affairs called The Price of Nostalgia. And it didn't hit it quite as big as this one, but it hit it reasonably big. The reason I mention it is to complement that article and cite in that article, we put out a bunch of simple charts at the Peterson Institute showing that the U.S. had basically been deglobalizing under both Democrats and Republicans since, depending which measure, roughly 1999-2000. So for all the talk about the China shock and globalization being at fault for this and that, basically the share of trade in the U.S. economy barely moves over the last 23 years, whereas every other country in the world, including China, including Germany, but not North Korea and Myanmar, their trade goes up enormously in this period. Our immigration rate has been going down steadily since the mid-late 90s. It is a fraction, even before Trump and COVID, it was a fraction of what it was in the mid-90s. The last real trade deal we concluded in terms of all us neoliberals selling out the American people by concluding trade deals, the last one was the US-Korea deal, which passed in 2007. And which was revised by Congress unilaterally after the deal was signed to protect American auto workers. Foreign direct investment as a share of U.S. GDP has been flat to down. It fluctuates a lot year to year because there are occasional big deals, but it's basically been flat to down for the last 25 years as a percentage of GDP. The U.S. has been deliberately deglobalizing on a range of areas in a period when all the other economies from China to Europe were globalizing further. And this is the same period in which we tell all these lies about immigration and trade stealing all our jobs.
Which is, by the way, part of the problem with inflation of wages. When you cut immigration, you will get
you get
wages
shortages
going
of workers.
at both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah. So anyway, so it is very much a when we talk about I also had an article 2 years ago called "The End of Globalization?" And I was forced to that title by the Foreign Affairs editors because my original title was "The Corrosion of Globalization," which they didn't like as well, which is fine. They're the boss. But the reason I wanted to call it "The Corrosion of Globalization," and that's what I refer to it in the article, is globalization is a multi-layered fabric. It is not just trade. It is not just immigration. It is business relationships. It is students and technological networks. It is flow of ideas. It is flow of soft power culture, from Korean soap operas to Szechuan peppercorns to Yao Ming playing NBA basketball. It is capital flows. It is long-term direct investment. It is so many things. And the focus, so much of our politics and our press and our discussion is on trade, and that's what these export controls are about and all these things. And that's actually in many ways the most resilient part. So what we've seen now, a colleague of mine at the Peterson Institute, Mary Lovely, has documented this. A new colleague of ours, Richard Baldwin, has also looked at this in recent work. Hyun Shin and his team at the BIS have talked about this, Barry Eichenreich. Everybody's coming up with the same answer, which is basically what I forecast, that trade just gets reallocated. It doesn't really go away. So if you look at total trade in the world, it's barely moved the last few years. It came back up after COVID, but total trade's barely moved. And even in these sectors where we're supposed to be decoupling, what's happening is China moves some production, some assembly, some transshipment to Vietnam or Mexico or Indonesia or wherever. US does the same to Mexico or wherever. And so you get a V trade where you used to get a straight line. And for a country like Vietnam or Mexico, this is a big deal. They get some share of rents of work that they didn't already have. And this has some benefits as it diversifies supply chains a bit, makes them a bit more resilient, and costs money because you're building redundancies, and every additional node, you're taking some money out of it, makes it a little more expensive. But in the end, the trade basically is still going on. There's no real decoupling there, except, again, very specifically high-end semiconductor chips and related technologies. However, the things we were talking about earlier, the scientific networks, the exchange of ideas and technology, some of the capital, and capital isn't just money, it's business practices, it's respect for intellectual property, it's interactions. These are the things that are eroding, and these are the things that, to me, are more important. And so that's the corrosion of globalization that's going on. And that's, again, it's certainly fed, and a concerning part of it is US-China conflict, but it's mostly driven by the choices the US has made over the last 25 years to just withdraw.
I warned all of you that I doubt that we would end up on anything other than a fairly bleak note, but at least we're among soulmates, and I'll give the last word to Philip.